Hi, I'm Jack Harrison, and I'm talking to you from County Galway, the borders of County Galway and County Clare in the Burren. And there's a Celtic school of yoga. This is kind of the nerve centre, my library here. And I just wanted to have a quick chat about the Celtic school of yoga and where it came from, where the ideas came from, the whole connection between the Celtic world and yoga. And it's really obviously just an introduction to this. I went down to the Hazelwood recently, so if you're looking for continuity in the video making, I'm afraid I had my hair cut in the meantime, so it won't be perfect continuity. My hair's a bit shorter now than it was that you're going to see than it is when you're going to see later. But that's okay. I just want to comment on the thing as we go along. So obviously this film was made in two sections. And the second half is actually earlier than the first, which is probably a suitable thing for the Celtic school of yoga and for yoga in general, in the sense that we get this sense of timelessness and anything can happen at any time, even the past becoming the future becoming past and what have you. But I just wanted to give a quick introduction and then we'll go to the talk in the Hazelwood. And in the Hazelwood, I really just kind of muse on the poem by W.B. Yeats, The Song of Wandering Aengus, and how he began it with, I went down to the Hazelwood. I suppose in a sense it all began with this idea of the Celtic school of yoga and Ashling for the 21st century. I wrote a book on it with a colleague a few years ago, and I've been doing music and bringing Indian ideas and yoga ideas and Sanskrit ideas together with the Celtic world, the Irish language and stories and mythology and folklore. And it seems to me that there are so many parallels in the whole thing, So, and it really kind of dependent on the Indo-European connection. I'll just have a look, go to a map here where you can see the different movements of people in the Indo-European world. And it all began somewhere in the Black Sea and spread east and spread west. And these are the ideas that came into India ultimately to express themselves with yoga, and which also came into Ireland and many other places in Europe and in the areas in between, in Asia. But we have this phenomenon of preservation at the peripheries, where things seem to last longer the further away from the center we go. So, ideas of philosophy and ideas of where we are in the world and our place in the universe are quite similar, and even folk traditions, and we can go into it in more detail in a later talk. I'm hoping to be producing many more of these talks, just quick little things over the next year or so. Even folk memories, even things that were done, especially to do with, one that springs to mind is to do with horses. I'm speaking here on the island of Achinish, close to the island of Achinish. It's the peninsula of Achinish, which means the island of horses, or the island of the female horse, the mare. And there's a group of 5 or 6 unicorns, I call them, out in the field next door to the house here, next door to the yoga studio. The whole thing just kind of meshes, And there was this tradition about horses and how they were used in the choosing of a prince or of a king in the Irish tradition, which is almost exactly the same as that described in the Indian tradition in Sanskrit. It's described by an outsider, by a traveller to Ireland in the 12th century, Giraldus Cambrensis, and he just talks about this, what he called a barbaric ritual, using horses to confirm the sovereignty of a king in the landscape. And exactly the same ritual was performed in India. And there are so many of these parallels to do with, which just bring yoga to life in this landscape. Of course, yoga itself is an Indo-European word. and we all own it. Now that's a whole different discussion, cultural appropriation. I'm hoping to do a little talk on cultural appropriation soon. I hope that you might be able to see it. But firstly, let me just come to the essence of the Celtic School of Yoga and how it ties up with the Boyne Valley. This festival, as you know, was meant to be in the Boyne Valley, meant to be at Townley Hall on the banks of the Boyne. And that's a place I worked for 10 years, not in Townley Hall, but at Newgrange. I was involved in designing the exhibition, and kind of pretty much for about the best part of 10 years I was there, coming and going, and talking to people and working on the project, and it finally came to fruition, and it has been a huge success there. So here we have Newgrange, the birthplace of Aengus Og, a stone's throw from where you are, or you're supposed to be right now, at the Boyne Valley, at Townley Hall, but just across the river. This was the hostel on the Boyne, Brún na Boine. And I've spoken to, as part of my work there, I've spoken to several professors of archaeology, and the general conclusion is that this was a cathedral, and a cathedral to the earth and the sun. In other words, it was an expression of the earth's yearning for the sun, that the sun on the midwinter solstice would come, rise over the escarpment up opposite the tomb, and then shine up the passageway to illuminate the inner chamber. And there was it's this idea of, just the rapture of life, going and beginning and ending, and then the future coming and the past resonating, the ancestors. You even have, in terms of the Indo-European connection, you even have the idea, which is very likely, of kind of burning ghats on the side of the Boyne River in the same way as they have it in Varanasi in India. You know that the whole of the Boyne River might have been filled with these burning ghats, which were used, not called ghats in the Celtic tradition, of course, but it was this cremation ritual, and that the remains of the prominent people in the society would be brought back up into the tomb to make sure that the sun, once again, would begin on its path towards summer. And here we are at midsummer. Looking out my window, I can see the sunset at its furthest point north almost. And it's amazing, this whole cycle of coming and going. Of course, the mythology above this tomb is that Aengus Og was born there. Aengus Og, the god of love and music and poetry, the son of youth, and he had 4 birds flying around his head, which represented kisses he got from various people whom he had made fall in love and have babies and have families and just progress the whole life and the rapture of living. The 4 birds represented kisses, and I always think that, I always include 4 birds in my emails, because the X is a sign of a bird, and we're told sometimes that the X, being a kiss, is associated somehow with Angus's 4 birds that flew around his head at any time. He grew up, he was born at Newgrange. He was the son of the Dagda, who was a good god, who was the sun god, and he was the son, his mother was the Boyne River, the goddess Boand, whose other name, or earlier name, was Bovinda. Bovinda, of course, sounding very like Govinda. In fact, the word go and the word bo mean the same thing, a cow. It was a pastoral economy, a pastoral structure. And Govinda and Bovinda. Bovinda was his mother, the mother of Aengus Og, and Aengus was the god of love and music and poetry. He grew up and he fell in love with a lady called Care. The first thing, being an Irish god of love and music and poetry, the first thing that happened, of course, was that his beloved faded away into the mists and got turned into a swan and was condemned to somehow fly and swim on the lakes and rivers and the sea of the west coast of Ireland. And it was Angus's journey to go to try to find her. So all this kind of yoga stuff is so, the practice and the yearning and the rapture, so tied up with the whole mythology. For me, now this is just for me, by the way. I'm not trying to impose it on anybody else. But for me, it's so tied up with the Irish mythology, the idea of Angus Og growing up, falling in love, and then having to spend the whole of his life looking for his beloved somewhere in the west coast of Ireland. I'll talk a little bit about that later when I get into the Hazelwood itself. It's this idea that we began to practice for the Celtic school of yoga, that we would have three principles: that you would open to the rapture of living, integration, that you would actually draw into yourself and make the whole world yours, and expansion, that you would expand into the wider world. So it seemed to me that the expression of the cathedral, the expression of the earth, as expressed in this cathedral to the sun, was this, was to draw in to itself, and then expand out into the universe and begin the summer again. I don't know if Kerr found, or if Angus found Kerr in the end in the swans. Some of the stories say that he found her and he himself got turned into a swan, and they both flew off and had 7 cygnets and just spent most of their life swimming around in the lakes and the sea. And some people say he's still looking. Yeats, in his poem, as we'll talk about later in this talk, he was of the idea that Angus was still looking, and that he was still looking. Yeats, he was still looking for this beloved who had been turned into a swan. And he was going to continue looking. He was going to continue looking until he found her. And it was really, in a sense, the journey, that was the important thing. Not the fruits, not what he got, not what Angus was looking for, but the actual journey. And along his journey, the story is that Angus made all these people fall in love with each other and have babies and families and children, and the world begins again. Newgrange expresses herself as the earth, draws the sun into her, and then expresses out again into the universe, everything to begin again.
So here we are in the Hazelwood in the Burren in County Clare. You can hear the stream in the background, bees, birds. Yeats's poem starts, "I went down to the Hazelwood because a fire was in my head." I always think this is it's really meaningful to me in terms of the yoga, and I always think it's a translation of the possible translation of the second sutra potentially. So rather than saying yoga is for the control of the currents of the mind or something like that, I translate it as, I went down to the Hazelwood. In a way, that's what we do, because a fire was in my head. I went down to the Hazelwood because a fire was in my head. This is why we do the yoga. This is why we come to these places. I went down to the Hazelwood because a fire was in my head. And then the actions, he says, I plucked and peeled a hazel wand and tied a berry to a thread. So he's going to fish for something, in the stream. I plucked and peeled a hazel wand. The hazel was an interesting tree, possibly one of the really important things to the Tuatha Dé Danann in the Irish tradition. And there's a little wren just from the rock, just flew past. This is why we do the yoga, It's for this kind of exuberance of nature, exuberance of ourselves. I plucked and peeled a hazel wand and tied a berry to a thread. The actions. When white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out. Maybe it was the dawn he was thinking of. Maybe it was the sunrise. Maybe it was the sunset. The stars were flickering out into being or flickering out into the dawn. Who knows? Later on he talks about the brightening air, so it may have been the dawn. One way or another was this liminal space, the space between, where everything happens. I plucked and peeled a hazel wand and tied a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I tossed the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. Again, when we look at the yoga practice, it's the idea of doing the yoga practice itself, just for the very doing of it, just for the exuberance of it, the rapture of it, rather than looking for a fruit. In the way he threw the berry into the stream, attached to the thread, but he didn't know what he was going to get. In fact, what he got initially was not what he was going to get ultimately. When white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I tossed the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. When I laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame, but something rustled on the floor, and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, and she called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. So of course the poem is called The Song of Wandering Aengus, and it's based on the old Irish god of love and music and poetry, Aengus, mock old Aengus, the son of youth, who was born at Newgrange in the Boyne Valley. And when he grew up, he fell in love with a woman called Care. And like Yeats's muse, Maud Gonne, Care faded into the brightening air. Yeats saw himself as Aengus in this quest after his lover, after his beloved, after his muse, Maud Gonne. And he saw himself as Aengus having to look around all the roads in Ireland and all the forests in Ireland and all the lakes and all the seas in Ireland to try to find her. She'd been turned into a swan somewhere on the west coast, Angus's beloved Care. And Yeats saw himself as this mythical creature, this mythical person, this god of love and music and poetry, whose job it was to make people fall in love with each other and have children and just again be rapturous about nature. And she faded into the brightening air. She faded into the dawn. She faded into the sunset. When I'm old, and now I'm old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone and kiss her lips and take her hands and wander through long dappled grass and kiss till time and times are done. So the idea that regardless that he couldn't find this lady, that he couldn't find his muse, that he couldn't find the ultimate aim of his yoga, of his being, of his living, he would just keep doing it. So we keep doing our practice, we keep doing our meditation, we keep coming down to the Hazelwood, regardless. Now I'm old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, and I will find out where she has gone, and kiss her lips and take her hands, and wander through long dappled grass, and pluck till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. So in the end, he gets these silver apples of the moon and the golden apples of the sun. In the end, he gets not what he expected from throwing his little fishing rod, his little berry tied to a thread, tied to a hazel wand, into a stream, he gets everything. He gets the whole world. You know, you discover by going down a path that you can't see, not by going down somebody else's path, not by going down the break in the woods, not by going into the road that everybody else has traveled, but rather into your own road. Make your own road, just into the place where the forests are deep and dark. And you come into a clearing and you find not the frightening thing maybe that you were afraid of, but the whole world. I went down to the Hazelwood because a fire was in my head. We plucked and peeled a hazel wand and tied a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I tossed a berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. And when I laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame. But something rustled on the floor and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, and she called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. And now I'm old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, but I will find out where she has gone and kiss her lips and take her hands and wander through long dappled grass and pluck till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare,
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna.